Oh, there she is. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sue Hodgen, the chair of the Planning Board here in Southport, and I'm calling us to order at 6:02. This is a special called meeting of the Planning Board. I'll ask that everyone silence or turn off their cell phones, please. We'll start, as we do each meeting, by removing any hats, and those that can or will, please stand while Board Member Scott Jones delivers our invocation, and then we'll follow with our allegiance to country and flag.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us together tonight. Give us guidance and wisdom as we help make decisions to guide the city. Be with us as we make these decisions, and be with everyone as we travel back home. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
I will note that Johnny Joyner is not here tonight. He is traveling. Item D is the approval of the agenda. The members were issued this in advance of the meeting. Do I hear a motion to approve?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Thank you. There's a motion on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Though the agenda was published and it was available here tonight, I'll reiterate that this is a special meeting of the Planning Board, fully dedicated to information and discussion of conditional zoning. At the Planning Board's regular monthly meetings, public comment is received on subjects relative to matters before the board. Oftentimes, comments are also given unrelated to current applications or even on matters not within the board's purview. Tonight, we will not be taking public comment. Those should be held and made at next week's regular meeting. The agenda does show, however, item F, that questions and comments regarding conditional zoning will be entertained at the conclusion of staff's presentation. Again, these questions must be directed at conditional zoning. If not, I'll interrupt and ask that you return next week. Moving on in our agenda then, I'll ask Development Services Director Travis Henley to ready himself for the update on our proposed zoning amendment. Members can raise their hands and ask questions as we go. It's good for other members' trains of thought, good for staff purposes, as in what other information might be helpful for understanding, and absolutely good for public absorption. For the public attending, please make notes if you need to, but I ask that you hold your questions to the end. Travis.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board, members of the public. Good evening. Again, conditional zoning, again, just a brief agenda, talking about, general process-related things related to, where we are in the process. Discussion of the changes that occurred following the input that we received from the Planning Board at their February 16th meeting. Discussion of one more example, and it's not because I just forgot to mention it or anything like that, but it's one more example that I think helps color in why conditional zoning can be a really great tool. And then some conclusions, questions, and we'll go from there. For those of you that were here last time, I promise this will not be a 3.5-hour presentation. It will only be 3 hours and 20 minutes. Just kidding. All right, so as a reminder, let me back out of the way here a little bit. I presented this as an idea at the Planning Board's January meeting. At the February meeting, we had, again, just me rambling on for 3.5 hours on this topic and getting feedback from the board. Here in March, the March 8th meeting today is the generalized update, questions, that sort of thing. This does not replace the public hearing that was called for the 16th. This is in addition to the public hearing on the 16th. fair warning, the planning board agenda would be full without this on it next week. So we've got a lot to cover. At the 16th meeting, this will be on the board's agenda as a voting item. The options available to the board are to recommend approval, recommend denial, or table with additional direction for staff to come back to you. At whatever point the board reaches a recommendation, the item will be forwarded to the aldermen for their consideration, and they'll have the ability to approve it, deny it, table it, or remand it back to the planning board with direction for further planning board action. So, just going to run through these changes relatively briefly. The feedback we received from the planning board at the February 16th meeting was that putting flexibility into what would be allowed in a conditional rezoning from a development standard, dimensional standard, and use standard perspective was the desired route to go. So the updated language, as everyone will see in the packet when it is published on Friday that Tanya already has and is building the agenda around, will reflect that in section 211B. Now, as I was going back and reviewing my presentation from last time and reviewing, kind of putting the language together, I realized that I maybe wasn't as clear on one particular point that I could have been, so I want to hit on that point now. Flexibility is good to a point, but there are certain standards of the ordinance that are not to be deviated from. I was never presenting this as if they would be deviated from, but I apologize that I wasn't explicitly clear in that standard. These are 5 that I identified that would be generally applicable to every project. There's going to be, as various projects come forward, it's going to be clear that there are other standards of the ordinance that we're not willing to budge on. But that's a case-by-case thing with conditional zoning. Traffic study threshold. We are not going to have an applicant for conditional rezoning come in here and say, yes, I understand that the threshold is 500 trips per day and I'm going to generate 4,000 trips per day, but I don't think I should have to do a traffic study. That is not how this works. Stormwater. Stormwater standards apply evenly. If it trips the state stormwater permit requirements, then our standards go into effect. It's uniform, it's automatic. Open space. Again, if we're talking about residential projects, it's already in the ordinance that if it's residential, it's already in the draft language, that if it's a conditional rezoning, 20% of the property minimum open space, just like in a PUD. HOA requirements, those are from the state. The state requires that. Water and sewer requirements, we're not going to deviate from the standards that we set from a water and sewer standpoint in terms of, how you're hooking up to our water system or how you're constructing our water system and those sorts of things. Just wanted to be clear on that point before we go any further.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
On any of those, but open space in particular. So are the aldermen, will they have the power to, for whatever reason, say, well, we'll let you only have X amount of open space and they can override, the amount they have to have?
The way the draft language is written, doing so would be violating the ordinance.
So they will not have the authority to override that?
No, not the way the ordinance is currently written. No. Moving on, from a process standpoint, the feedback we heard from the planning board was that we would shift, right now the ordinance gives the planning board discretion on whether to call a public hearing on a rezoning. This would, the proposed language now makes it required that the planning board holds a public hearing on every conditional rezoning. There is no nuance to the size or scope of the conditional rezoning. If it's a conditional rezoning, the planning board's holding a public hearing prior to a recommendation being made. That includes sign posted on the property, mailed notice to every property owner within 500 feet, and a 2-week continuous publishing of notice of the hearing in the newspaper, which in this case is the Pilot. Sorry. Yes.
The public hearing is prior to the submittal to the planning board, right?
That's the public input meeting. I'm coming to that one.
Okay.
This would be at the same discretion that the planning board used to call a public hearing on this text amendment. It would function just like that. It's just automatic.
So it's in addition to the public input meeting that would be required from that applicant?
Correct. There's a lot of uses of the word public around here, so I understand how this can get tricky. Yes, sir.
And also too, that's only if the public input meeting met the requirements. We wouldn't hold the public hearing until the actual public input meeting met the requirements that were set out to even forward that to a public hearing.
That is correct.
Okay.
Now, in my experience, we're not always able to tell that a public input meeting met the requirements until we hear from people. And somebody may not think to call myself or Mo as we're working on a conditional rezoning. When they get the notice, they may say it in the planning board meeting. Hey, I never got notice of the public input meeting, but I've lived here for 30 years. So the planning board, and I've seen this discretion used in other places, planning board has the authority to tell the applicant, go hold another public input meeting, do it right, and come back to us when you've done that. There's no issues with the planning board doing that. There's no issues with the aldermen doing that if the project gets to their level. There's the public input meeting. So the only change here, I certainly heard feedback about wanting to provide notice. The only change in the language is at the same time the notice goes out to the property owners, the notice also has to go to the UDO administrator and the city clerk. The challenge here with the city providing notice of an applicant-held public input meeting prior to a submittal being made is that, well, the application hasn't been made. No fees have been paid yet. It's not an official application. So what we don't want to have happen is for there to be inconsistency in the way the city is putting notice out on these projects. The applicant may mail their notice on a Saturday. None of us are here. So if we're providing notice on public input meetings later for one project versus another, it's inconsistent. It's treating projects differently from a process perspective. What I would say is if there's a desire amongst the planning board to have the city provide the notice in addition to what the applicant's doing for these public input meetings, that we should wait and not require the public input meeting until after they've submitted the project. Then we've got an application and we can be part of the process of controlling it. But it's, in my view, it's one or the other. If there's input on that question now, I'm more than happy, or we can come back to it later on.
It seems kind of disjointed to me to have them do a public input meeting and then all of a sudden we're behind in noticing, or we didn't know about it and end up making them go back and do it again because we weren't able to check it out. I mean, I defer to other members to speak to this too, but I'd rather us look like we had it all together before that happens. I mean,
There is, I mean,
just me.
Well, one thing I was thinking about with that is, just like the Board of Aldermen have their liaisons here to get a perspective on what we're doing, we in turn could send somebody from the board just to observe their public input meeting and make sure that they're meeting the criteria as far as their information that they're giving to the public as well. And then we could report that back to the board. That might be one way of just doing that, to give the board members a heads up as to what was discussed. We're not actually participating in the meeting, we're just observing the meeting for the board.
I think that's a good idea, but I think that those individuals should be staff, not the planning board. One, because you all already do enough as it is, and I hate to put more work on you. Two, there's only 2 of us. There's 9 in a usual sense of you. It's more likely to be consistent that we're looking at the same thing versus if it's spread out. Not to say that it wouldn't be consistent, but the appearance of consistency is as important as actual consistency. And again, you all already do too much. You're volunteers, please remember that.
The intent of the public input meeting is to put together a better application, correct?
Yes.
Is there any other intent? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out sort of the stacking order of where that falls in line.
It's for the applicant to try to put together a better project that speaks to, what public input is on the project. But it's also to give the public a heads up of what's coming prior to it showing up on a planning board agenda. So if I'm, just chilling on my front porch and I get a notice in the mail about this public input meeting, oh, hey, there's a project that may go there. It could be 6 months before it gets to the planning board, but at least when it gets to the planning board, I knew that such a thing may have been coming. And again, we're also now under this language sending mailed notice prior to the planning board meeting too. So there's sort of a double effort there. Okay. The last big change, Appendix A. We didn't talk about this much last week, or however many weeks ago it was. Appendix A is no longer in a table form, it's in a list form. Every type of case that was in Appendix A now has its own list. That list is the exact same list that staff uses as the checklist of reviewing a project. It's the exact same list that shows up in the planning board's packet and the Board of Aldermen packet for documentation of how staff comments are being provided to an applicant and how projects conform to the requirements of the Unified Development Ordinance. The only real changes that we're talking about here, other than just the construction of the section, is that some of the sections in Appendix A for conditional zoning, which now has its own section, are moved from required to be locked in to be approximations, the same way that a PUD submittal can be an approximation. There's nothing that can be an approximation in a conditional rezoning that isn't allowed to be an approximation in a PUD already today. And you'll see that in the language when it comes out on Friday. The other thing that we noticed is not in Appendix A is that there's no mention in Appendix A of traffic generation counts. It's not to say, and don't think this, it's not to say that it hasn't been enforced, it has been, but it wasn't called out in Appendix A. So it's in there now for every case in which it would be applicable to, and there's also a reference that says when you put these traffic generation counts on your plan and you see that they're above the threshold of needing a traffic study, you need to do a traffic study. That's been lost on folks in the past because it wasn't explicitly mentioned in Appendix A. It's in there now. So, I want to run through an example real quick just to show where flexibility can be helpful. Piney Run Farms. The middle entity, the owner of this is Wilmington Compost Company. They were looking for a new headquarters. They had been kind of running out of the back of a truck and using New Hanover County's landfill as their composting, and they got too successful, and they wanted to expand. And they picked 72 acres on Highway 210 between Rocky Point and Hampstead that was already zoned for rural agriculture and already functioning as a landfill. It existed as a landfill prior to the county instituting zoning in 1988 and had remained as a landfill forever. And they requested a number of different uses. Again, already zoned RA. Some of those uses were allowable via special use permit. Some of those uses weren't even in our table of permitted uses at all. One of them, the one up top, is very clearly a bona fide farm purpose and is exempt from zoning under North Carolina general statutes. The other is an industrial use, but in the context of the site and what they were proposing to do, it kind of made sense. So this site, it's called the Running Deer Landfill. It was a notorious air quality violator. It was on and off on fire for years. Yeah. Basically, when you're a landfill and there's things you need to do to keep that trash from spontaneously combusting, and they were not doing those things. And so, off and on, the news would come out, hey, Running Deer's on fire. And it happened a lot. And it's sad, but it became sort of a running joke. Again, part of this process was Wilmington Compost Company was going to come in and help clean this up. And I'm pleased to report that they're well on their way. But a 72-acre landfill that spontaneously combusts is not easy to handle. This was their site plan. Well, that's actually more visible than I thought it would be. Essentially, you've got a lot of different areas across the site. One of them is, down here, compost processing zone. This is where, vegetative debris would be dropped off. Long term, they wanted to do farm soil testing and all kinds of other stuff. There's eventually going to be retail areas for selling the compost to farmers, to landowners, to whoever. All these things mixed together, there was no zoning district that permitted every use that they had. It didn't exist in Pender County. Without this process, they would have come to us and said, hey, we have this project, what do you think? And the answer would have been no. There is no way to do it. But it existed. So they ran through the process. They had quite a few members of the public speak in favor of it, both ones that they had invited and also folks who just showed up organically. They had already started collaborating with the schools prior to even having their rezoning approved. They showed up in the public hearing with examples of different types of compost. It made the cleanup of the room after a little difficult, but it helped prove the point. And it was unanimously approved by the planning board and the commissioners, and they are operating today. As far as I know, it hasn't caught on fire in a while, which is great. Is every project going to be that? No. This is not a silver bullet. I will never, ever, there's no such thing as a silver bullet in planning. But from our land use plan, it was adopted in 2014, updated in 2020. Completing the land use plan, illustrating the city's vision for the future, does not ensure that its objectives will be met. The city must continuously work at accomplishing plan implementation and maintaining an effective planning program. One important concept is smart development. And there's a long list of factors that go into smart development. You'll hear it called smart growth too, but in this section of the ordinance, it calls it smart development. The traditional zoning districts that we have in Southport today do not allow those concepts to happen. They just don't. Conditional zoning is still a rezoning. It still has to be requested by the property owner. Even the city can't initiate a conditional rezoning. If the property owner doesn't ask for it, it doesn't happen. And then there's a whole list of other things that have to happen if they ask for it. In my experience, and I'm not saying that these examples aren't out there, but in my experience, a conditional rezoning is only a worthwhile option for somebody if they already need a rezoning anyway. And as a reminder, a general use rezoning is just switching from one zoning district to another, and every allowable use within that zoning district has to be considered. It's very difficult to evaluate those in a lot of cases. All conditional is locking in what exactly they want to do. If the flexibility that's afforded in conditional zoning is the only thing that they need, that's what the variance process is for. If they need to reduce their parking to save a tree, and what they want to do is allowed by the zoning district, they're just going to go for a variance. Variance is way, way simpler than a conditional rezoning and is a quasi-judicial decision with the Board of Adjustment as opposed to a legislative decision at the Planning Board and the Aldermen. It's a longer process. There's a lot less certainty for the applicant that their project is going to get approved. There's a lot less protections for them. There's a lot more discretion at the Planning Board and the Board of Aldermen level. And if I have the zoning I need already, there's no need to rezone at all. So it's, again, going to be a lot simpler just to deal with the administrative process. And if it's a commercial project, bring it before the Planning Board and receive my administrative approval. Or if it's a subdivision, or, R20, R10 subdivision, bring forward a preliminary plat, get my recommendation from the Planning Board, and get the approval from the Board of Aldermen. It's administrative. If it meets the standards of the ordinance as they're laid out, the city is legally obligated to approve it. The applicant is legally deserving of their approval. Now, can we deny it? Sure. Would that denial stand up in court? Probably not, unless we found a specific way in which it did not meet standards of the ordinance. Conditional rezoning gives us a lot more discretion to try to work with people while achieving these goals for the smart development. But all that taken into account, we're only allowing that to even be considered by mandating the most robust review process that exists, giving full consideration to the impacts of the project up front before even changing the zoning designation on the property, much less going through the major site plans or the preliminary plats where we're actually looking at the engineering drawings, and directly involving the public in the process at every step of the way. And again, it all goes back to this map. It all goes back to this land use plan. This was the vision. This is the adopted plan. This and the policies and goals and objectives that are within it. And every conditional rezoning gets evaluated for its conformance to this plan, this map, and the goals, objectives, and policies that are within it. That's all I've got for tonight. Again, we've got a public hearing next week. There will be, you'll have the draft language in front of you. Everyone in the public who will have taken the time to go look through the agenda will also have the draft language in front of them. And that's where we'll go from there. So any questions from the board, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Will you address again, Travis, I know you did this in our last meeting, but for those that may have missed it, can you discuss why only business is in the current conditional zoning text and the advantages and disadvantages there are to including residential zones in CZ applications?
Well, my understanding as to why business was only included to start with is, one, as a way to introduce conditional zoning to Southport. Conditional zoning is a relatively new tool that's explicitly allowed by statute, I should say. It's been used in North Carolina since the 90s. City of Charlotte was really the first ones. They're the pioneers of this. was upheld through court decisions through the 2000s and then finally added into statute officially as an allowable tool in, I forget exactly when, but it was sometime around the Great Recession. Why explicitly business was included? Likely because the PUD process continues to exist, and conditional zoning and the PUD process are very similar in terms of what they're allowing. So the advantages of well, let me start with the disadvantages of allowing residential. One, there's more conditional rezonings that could come forward if residential is allowed, because the vast majority, as our zoning map mimicking this map pretty well, the vast majority of land in Southport is zoned residential, not commercial. So just the sheer number of properties that would be eligible for a conditional rezoning goes up. They are complex by design. I mean, these are as complex as it gets from a development standpoint. So it's a lot of work on staff's end, on the planning board's end, on the alderman's end, on the public's end to try to understand how these, what these projects are and what the impacts are going to be. It's a lot of work on the applicant's end too. This is, conditional zoning existed my entire tenure in my previous role, and it was a struggle to try to convince folks to go with a conditional rezoning as opposed to a general use rezoning, because of the amount of effort that goes into getting a conditional rezoning application together. And then once you, from an applicant standpoint, if I get the conditional rezoning approved, I'm locked in. I can do what the board approved me to do. And if I want to change it, I've got to go back through the entire process over again, which again does nothing for the administrative burden problem. But the benefit to allowing residential to it, as opposed to just sticking with the PUD process, is that the PUD process is not effective in reaching those smart development goals the way it's currently designed. You have a minimum open space requirement within PUDs. That's wonderful. That's fantastic. I wish in my previous roles we had something that was that strong. But you also have a floor, so to speak, in terms of what you can do from a dimensional standpoint. So based on whatever your zoning is currently, you can only go down 40, you can only reduce all of those standards by 40%. And so if you've got a floor on how clustered you can go and a minimum open space you have to meet, there's an intersection point there. And there's no incentive to go above and beyond what the ordinance requires, effectively by design of the ordinance. And there's reasons for that, and I can understand those reasons. We're encouraging, smart development. We're giving flexibility to folks, but we don't want to drastically change the character of, what this is versus what this is. I get that, totally get it. But that's also part of the review of the conditional rezoning, is to make sure that we're not creating those conflicts. Or if we are creating those conflicts, we're doing so in a way that actually makes sense. That goes back to that second example I talked about on the 16th of February. As the project moved on, the clustering of that project got tighter and tighter. The lots got smaller and smaller because they were providing more of a buffer from the larger residential lots that surrounded it, because that was what the public that we were talking to was saying they wanted. And that worked for the applicant. So we started with, they requested a 5,000 square foot minimum lot size, but none of their lots that they showed on their plan were any smaller than 6,000 or 6,500. Then we moved to a condition of approval that said that any lots that directly bordered onto those neighboring properties had to be no smaller than what the current zoning that they had allowed for. And then we ended up with no lots that touched the adjoining properties at all. It was open space that surrounded the entire thing. So one, it made the condition null and void, but two, it increased the natural buffer that was between the two projects, or between the two properties. And that led to that project being successful. It was that more than anything else. It was that feature of that project. Is that going to work in every case? No. I don't expect it to. But that's why there's a public input meeting. That's why there's a public hearing at the planning board, and there's a public hearing at the alderman, to make sure that we're getting that feedback, that these decisions are not being made in the dark. In fact, quite the opposite. These decisions are made with the brightest spotlight you can imagine on them. By design, they should be. I think that answers the question. Okay. Felt like I was talking in a circle there.
So, conditional zoning does not take the place, the PUD zoning will still be in our UDO for those who choose to go in that direction. This is just adding an additional option for applicants to consider. And basically, like I said at the last meeting, it's another tool in the city's toolbox to be able to work with applicants.
I was about to say tool in the toolbox. Yes, that's what it is.
I think that's one of the things in my conversations with folks and listening to comments before, was that there may have been some confusion that conditional zoning is not, we're not going to throw away the UDO and everything become a conditional zoning application. It's just, we're not abandoning all of that. We're adding to what we've got.
Yeah, if anything, the only place we would be throwing the UDO is at the applicant. But in addition to the UDO, we get to throw this at them too. In an administrative process, if the zoning allows for what somebody wants to do, it doesn't matter what this says. If the zoning allows it, that's the process. Now, again, as I've said multiple times, Southport's done a really good job of making their zoning map and their future land use map look similar. That's a good thing. But that future land use map is a lot more vague than a zoning map. And there's development that the land use plan itself explicitly asks for that the zoning map cannot accommodate today.
Would it be okay to use, hypothetically, Indigo project
Sure.
to look at this? So if they were to opt to use conditional zoning, can you talk about the advantages and disadvantages for the applicant and then also for the city?
Sure. In terms of that project, the advantage to the applicant is that the floor, so to speak, on the dimensional standards no longer applies. They could propose their own dimensional standards, their own list of uses, that sort of thing, which is not that different from what's allowed in the PUD process today. The benefit is that a conditional rezoning is there's a lot more discretion, in my opinion, in a conditional rezoning, because you don't have those specific standards. So it's the way PUD kind of works is that there's some administrative element to it because there's those specific standards that we're saying that an applicant must meet, whereas in a conditional rezoning, it is a lot more nuanced. It's a lot more, we're reviewing a site-specific plan. The other real benefit, I think, to the city is going to be from an environmental standpoint if they choose to go this route. Because again, you're not running into that intersection point of required open space provision, but the lack of ability to cluster. The majority of that property is zoned R20. So the lowest they could go from a single-family standpoint is 12,000 square feet. I mean, the proposed Oakton project has lot sizes smaller than that, and it's just R10. So it's very, very difficult to do any sort of clustering and, significant protection of open space at a 12,000 square foot minimum lot size. If that's what the planning board, the aldermen, the community, the land use plan all come to consensus that that's what we want. But that's, again, we're all hypothetical at this point. It would be, if were this text amendment to be approved, it would be at the applicant's discretion whether they wanted to come in as a PUD or come in as a conditional rezoning. I know which one I would pick, but that's me.
And so, to be clear about that, when an applicant comes in, hopefully, before they're ready to put something in, we can't make them do conditional zoning, but staff can explain that this is a consideration for them to make that decision. We can't make them do this.
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely. The way it's worked in my experience is that essentially someone comes in the front door and asks to talk to Mo or myself and says, this is my idea. How can it happen? And if that idea already requires a rezoning, that's where conditional zoning really comes on the table. Again, the process is far too complex, and there's so much effort on the front end that the applicant has to do to be ready to take this on, that if the zoning already allows for what the property owner wants to do, there really is no incentive to go this route. The same way that there's no incentive to go the PUD route in the same scenario. So, yeah, we hope that those conversations happen. We want those conversations to happen. One, because, it usually will lead to a better outcome for everybody involved. Two, if it's clear that, say, let me try to think of a hypothetical. Well, say somebody submitted oh man, I knew I was going to do that. Somebody came in to talk to Mo and I with a conditional rezoning proposal where Oakton is proposed to go. And Oakton is zoned R10. It's in the medium density residential future land use category, which calls for 4 units an acre, single family, duplexes, that sort of thing. It's a lot of the incorporated area of the city is medium density residential. And they show us a plan that shows, 5-story townhomes at 12 units an acre. Well, that's an egregious example. Let's throw in a Wendy's too. Why not? Clearly, that doesn't work. And we can tell them that and say, hey man, you might want to go back to the drawing board on this, because staff's going to recommend denial. And I mean, that's, in my experience, staff even floating a denial recommendation has effectively stopped a number of potential conditional rezonings in their tracks before they even submit. And it's not that we don't want to, we don't want to review the projects. It's not that. It's, we have a plan. That plan is drawn from public input. The plan says what the plan says, and that's what staff follows. If there's a reason to deviate from the plan, that's for the planning board and the aldermen and the public to decide. But staff, our job is to implement this. We don't deviate from it. It could be, and I'll be honest, I studied conservation subdivisions as my thesis project in grad school at UNCW. And looked at the ways that different communities across the state were incentivizing that particular type of development. So a project could come forward that could be the best possible conservation subdivision in the world. It's going to get me published in scholarly articles, all that great stuff. But if it doesn't fit that, it's recommendation to deny. It's automatic. That's how those conversations on the front end work. And they're not often fun, but they're necessary.
Thank you, Travis, and staff, Mo, for your work on all of this information. Let's move to our participants' questions and comments. Tanya, I think you had said there was one individual.
Rich Bandera.
Hello, I'm Rich Bandera. I live at 409 North Burrington Ave in Southport. I've been a resident for 21 years here in town. I did receive a copy of the text amendment. It was published on the city website that it was available. And obviously I have some concerns about it in that it seems like the dimensional standards for traditional zoning under the conditional zoning process, the guardrails are taken off. And that there's no, I mean, an applicant can say, I want to do something 60 feet high, no setback requirements, nothing. There's no attempt at any kind of reining any of that in. The second thing I'd like to say, in terms of the land use plan that the development director was talking about, and Mr. Fiss's question about how things might relate to a possible development, is that what the future land use map is, the yellow areas that R20, and it's considered low density under the land use map. The sort of darker shade of yellow is R10 or medium density. And in the land use map, and this all came up through the process of Project Indigo, and what it said was inappropriate uses and appropriate uses, and inappropriate uses in both of those areas are considered industrial or commercial. And the density limit on that is in the R20 district 2 to 3 units per acre, which is higher than, you know, what the 12,000 square foot, if you take an acre and divide it by 2, that's kind of what you get, it's 2 dwellings. And in the R10 district, the medium density district, it's 4 units per acre. That is the cap. And so that is exactly what our ordinance says now, which is 43,600 square feet is an acre, divided by 4, 10,000 square foot per lot. There is absolutely no change in the density that exists, the way the code is written right now. So what I heard out of this presentation is that you can't have a 60-story apartment block and a Wendy's. Of course, that obviously would be kind of turned down. But what I didn't hear is what I just said, what the density was, and what the recommendations of the plan, the future land use plan says. And it's not that different than what exists right now. And they kind of dovetail, like was mentioned, to our zoning map and to this land use map. They're very similar. So saying all that, I can't really fully understand the need to increase conditional zoning into residential districts when part of the same presentation, what I heard, and which is part of a School of Government survey on conditional zoning that was published right around the time that this whole thing, the land use map, was adopted, and when the board approved that map. And what it says is that the process of rezoning, you have that kind of one particular standoff or one-off site that they looked at that was part of this presentation, and why that applicant couldn't do what they wanted to do. Well, a rezoning process takes less time than a conditional zoning process. So you could take that applicant, bring it to the board, bring it to the planning board, say, does this make sense the way it's written? Do we need to have conditional zoning that takes longer? And you can just, you can create new zoning districts, you could modify the land use map to kind of meld that a little bit tighter into something that makes sense instead of all these kind of scattered sites that could have to go through a longer, more dragged out process with limited staff to really review that. The other part of this is that I guess that in terms of the types, I mean, in this survey, what the majority of rezoning requests are commercial. And the second one is residential. I mean, those are the categories where somebody would want to do what they want. Going back to the dimensional requirements subject, is that the planning board about 2 months ago, maybe it's a little longer than that, in reaction, I think, to some of the commercial development proposals in town, just regulated height to 2 stories at 30 feet in the business district. They increased the rear yard setback from 10 feet to 20 feet. And in this language, you just basically ignore everything you just did. And so I'm kind of baffled by it, honestly. I'm not sure, I don't know why it's getting so far down the path on this. And I know you know that I've been vocal about it in the past, but I think I do have, I think, concerns about this that haven't changed since we talked about it 3 or so years ago. And I have a copy of that school of government survey that I can give to you. And I mean, I'm sure there's holes in some of what I've said, but I think there's some meat to what I've said as well in terms of using the traditional rezoning as the path to move ahead, not conditional zoning. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We'll get this to the clerk. Appreciate that. No one else had signed up, but is there anyone else here that has a question? Come on up here, Tracy. Come up, if you will, Shug. Thank you.
Short person. First, I wanted to say thank you very much, Mr. Henley. For us laymen, your talk last week was way over my head and a lot to digest. And I have to say to the planning board, kudos to y'all for digesting and understanding all of this because, wow, it was a lot. But your examples were really informing and, helped a layman like myself and like a lot of us to sort of understand. So my question's going to be kind of really layman-ish. I don't know how else to say it, but like what Rich said, so our regular zoning, let's just say the PUD thing that we were just talking about, that's everything that's in the UDO. So the language that applies to that, the standards and, all the rules and regulations for the PUD that's in this now. So this conditional rezoning, if somebody looked at that and said, well, I don't like those requirements for the PUD, is that where they come in and ask for this conditional rezoning that would then dismiss all the other rules and regulations that were in the PUD, in the UDO? Because I don't quite understand that, yeah.
So the way it would work is, yes, if there was something about if I was eligible to be a PUD, because that's the first thing, because there's acreage requirements for that too.
So they have to follow some of those rules of the PUD?
They have to follow all of them.
Oh, okay.
If they do the PUD process.
If they do the PUD, but then...
If, say I'm the developer, and I want to deviate from those PUD requirements, I can ask for them.
Okay.
It doesn't guarantee me an approval.
Right.
And I also have to, and I thank you for your question, because you're making me think of something I didn't say. Any sort of deviation from that has to be explicitly included in their application as to why. So it's very clear for the public, for the planning board, for, well, staff, quite frankly, to, one, know what we're looking at, and two, understand what the deviations are and why they're being deviated from. And all of those deviations, however many there are, there could be 50, there could be one, that all factors into the evaluation of the proposal. So, just because in a conditional rezoning that a deviation can be asked for, that doesn't mean it's granted, because it all falls back to
the land use.
that land use plan.
Well, I have another question,
Go
if
for
that's
it.
okay. How much input have you, percentage of input from the public have you seen has made a difference at all in, I know that one with the houses with that one, you just talked about it a minute ago. Seemed like the public input really helped form that so that it was more of a smart use and a more friendly development for all the neighbors and everything. So in your experience, talking about our town and everything and things that might go on, does the public input really do that, or was that just a fluky kind of case?
In my experience, the conditional rezonings that have truly been successful, the public has been not only just vocal, but effectively vocal.
That's what I was saying, being effective with the developer and then with their planning boards and their administration.
Right. And there's other conditional rezoning examples that, there's one that comes to mind in particular that some of y'all will probably get a kick out of. There was a proposal for so let me try to set the scene here. If you're familiar with Hampstead and you're familiar with where Topsail High School is, that's where the northern end of the Hampstead bypass is going to be. It's just right there at the high school. That's going to cause its whole set of other concerns, but that's for them to figure out now. There's a property back there behind where the bypass will be that was part of a NCDOT litigation and things like that. It was originally supposed to be an 800-unit master planned Pender County's Mayfair, essentially. But the bypass was going to go right through it. So it's kind of difficult to build a Mayfair where there's a highway in the middle. So they decided to shift gears and propose a 500-acre sand mine.
A what?
A sand mine. They were going to essentially take the top 20 feet of 500 acres for the sand. Part of it was going to be for the bypass. The rest of it was going to be for development. And it just so happened to be right next to a golf course community that had its own water system and its own wells. So as you might imagine, mining, wells,
That's not a good combination?
And so, no, it's not a good combination. And as you might imagine, the public was rather
Vocal about that?
maybe say a bit cross about it.
Okay.
And the applicant, in their infinite wisdom, decided to hold the public input meeting during early voting. And a lot of the big congregation areas in the Hampstead area were being used for voting. So they decided to hold their public input meeting at the Hampstead Library, which has a maximum capacity in their meeting room of 35 people. And 200 people showed up. And so we were having a commissioners meeting right up the street, and the fire marshal had to run out of the commissioners meeting to go deal with this because about every fire code under the sun was being violated by this. And of course, it was 40 degrees and it started raining. So the public there, the public input was, oh my gosh, the public input meeting was terrible. And so everybody got, this was before we ever got to a hearing. It was clear that this was not going to go very well, and the applicant withdrew their case.
Okay.
So
That's a good example.
effectively vocal. There's the big example I talked about last time where there was that neighborhood that was going to be the front door of this new neighborhood.
Yes.
That project was worked on for 2 years, and the public input, the only reason the public input to deny the project didn't work is because they actually bought property to go around
I
the
remember.
neighborhood.
The
So-
road.
Right, the
That was
road.
that road that they did, yes.
So-
That was a good example, yes.
Yes, so, and that's, that's another benefit of why the planning board holding a public hearing is good too, because, if these projects get reviewed and looked at and over and over and over again, and then the public hearing isn't until the alderman level, issues can come up that really the planning board exists because they have expertise. They know they can handle those issues. So,
Okay.
yes, honestly, I'm drawing
That's
a blank on a
that's-
conditional rezoning that didn't benefit in some way from
Okay.
public input.
I have one more question.
Go for it.
And this is kind of I don't know. I feel like our city administration this is a personal opinion. I feel like our planning board and our staff and our aldermen are really on top of what Southport needs to be and how to keep it, as the public and as all we want it. The thing that I thought about is down the road, if we get other people in on our planning board and on our aldermen that don't share those ideas, and this conditional zoning is available, that kind of worries me. So how many checks and balances could we have that would protect our town in case we did have some people in our administration that didn't support what was the smart development and what the public wanted, that kind of thing. So that's my last question. So I'll go sit down.
She saved the best for last. Did you see that? The board may have responses to that one. I don't mean to put you on the spot, and I have an answer, and I can say my answer first. But
I'll answer a little bit to that. It's called elections. Things can change every time, we see that all the time. You would hope that folks are committed to doing the right thing. But we can never guarantee that, Tracy. Just like some of the changes that we've made as a part of what we see as commitment to the town, they weren't done before. We can't explain why. We can't explain what somebody else might come forward in the future. And
I just love this town so much, and I know everybody does that participates and everything. That's just something to think about for the future. I just don't know if there's any checks and balances on that. Does the land use map come into that would help?
that's
ahead, Trev.
that's where staff sticking to this. I'm not going to say that feeling doesn't come into it, but if the land use plan says don't jump, we don't jump. Again, to Chair Hodgins' point, the elections point is well taken. The other piece of this is that not putting conditional zoning in place, if you think down the road about a board that would be willing to approve a not great conditional rezoning, that same board would have the power to change the ordinance to make whatever that conditional rezoning is just by right and just allow it to happen. So
I think that's a great point, Travis, to say if some of what the board is talking about now and that staff has already been talking about, cleaning up or our UDO, cleaning up what we've got currently, which is so much better than what it was. Thank God for what we've got now, for what we went through a year ago. Less than, it seems like a lot longer than that, doesn't it? But continuing to work on that so that we don't, as we already have, been caught with our pants down on things and had to say afterwards, and I'm being nice, this needs fixing. Why didn't we think of this before? But thank goodness it's a static document that we can go back and make those changes on. But you have to, I think, for staff to be committed to saying, this is the Bible, basically. We don't go outside of this. We make our corrections. We make sure that we're taking care of town by the things that we include in here, the changes that we make, and adhere to them. That's why we're all sitting here, to make sure that things are held accountable to this. So I think continuing to see improvements we can make, experiences that staff has had other places, drawing on our good and bad experiences for all of us here in town, helps us make this better. It's never going to be perfect. It's not meant to be. So I think that's for me, the crux of all this is continuing to add to the options that we've got in all of it.
And can I? I'll wait.
My name is Jenny Prunty, and I live in Indigo Plantation, and I have another hypothetical, Travis. So let's say that this conditional zoning text amendment change goes through, and the developer for the ETJ, i.e. Project Indigo, is looking to resubmit an application. Why would the developer choose conditional zoning versus PUD? In what cases would that be attractive for the developer to develop this land with conditional zoning?
So the ETJ area, where it's low-density residential, 2 to 3 units an acre, where it would be beneficial to go the PUD route versus to go conditional zoning really depends on the product type that they want to do, because the land use plan evaluation is going to be the same regardless. So in low-density residential, really all it calls for is single-family detached currently. That's the way the land use plan is written, and I can go forward about 60 slides and find it, because I've got all the old slides too. But so the benefit for the developer to go CZ is that they can cluster the lots more. The density that it gets evaluated against is still 2 to 3 units an acre, and at 12,000 square feet, they could get to 2 to 3 units an acre. That would fit in that. But at the same time, so would 5,000 square foot lots and a lot more open space being preserved would also be 2 to 3 units an acre and would still meet the land use plan. And that's the smart growth, smart development stuff that the land use plan talks about. So I understand that there's larger lots which lead to more open space on each individual lot versus smaller lots where everything's condensed. Yes, you have more impervious surface on a lot, individual, residential lot perspective, but then you've got a lot more open space that isn't touched at all. The other benefit for a developer there is it's less land to clear, it's less roads to build, it's less water and sewer lines to run. So it's just cheaper for them to build. And it's also, if those water and sewer lines and the roads are going to be turned over to the city of Southport, it's less for us to have to maintain. That would theoretically, holding all else constant, would be the same project. So it's difficult to talk about this hypothetically. And it would be a lot easier if I had a whiteboard and I could draw on stuff. I don't want to draw on that board. I don't think they would like me. They're already doing me a solid by being here and filming this, so I don't want to ruin that. But at some point, we'll get in a room and a whiteboard and we'll start drawing stuff. And, that's where you start to look at the different patterns that, that's why that land use plan is vague. There is no low density residential, medium density, all those little things that are in the tiniest font possible. They don't reference zoning districts. They're just future land use categories. They leave it open. Yes, R20 fits into low density residential, but so would the exact same number of units that would be allowed in R20, but all of them clustered up in the most appropriate to build on areas and leaving the rest as open space. And one of the benefits of conditional zoning is that you can put conditions on it. And so wouldn't it be wonderful if somebody were to propose a project like that and a condition of approval is that all of those open spaces get covered under a perpetual conservation easement that goes to North Carolina Coastal Land Trust or something like that. So not only are we, we're making sure that, if ordinances change down the road, God forbid an ordinance would change that would allow open space in a subdivision to be developed, but crazier things have happened in the Cape Fear region. So if we have it under a perpetual conservation easement, we can make absolutely certain that the only thing that ever happens on that property is natural and maybe some walking trails and stuff like that. So that's very high-minded, naive Travis talking about how great this all can be. I will not stress enough that there is no such thing as a silver bullet in planning, but you know what? We're going to try. And I'll continue to be naive until, I'll never stop. So.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I wanted to speak on two other things for Tracy's question. The first is, and this, starts to feed into a larger paradigm shift, is that my hope is that we start to get out of the habit of only amending the ordinance when we're responding to a problem. And that we start to, and I know this will be a shock to everybody in this room, but one thing I'm very good at is going down rabbit holes. And, doing that, you can start to see the logical conclusion of things and start to realize, whoa, man, if somebody ever tried that, that's not good. That wouldn't be very fun to have to explain why we have to approve this project that we really, really don't like. It takes time. It's a function of life in 2023 that we're all just moving from, wildfire to wildfire. But over time, we will get to that point, and we'll start to, really start to be proactive with our amendments to the ordinance, as Chair Hodgen just said. And the other reason why I think that this is really going to be fine is we called a special meeting about a process change in the ordinance, and look how many people showed up. And it's being filmed. We've got another meeting about this same topic next week, and you all took a beautiful afternoon. Maybe could have used a few logs on the fire compared to yesterday, but took a beautiful afternoon to come in here and learn about a process change to an ordinance, which is the most dry thing we could be talking about. We're gonna be fine. I have no doubt, and that's why, in my opinion. So.
Is there anyone else that would like to make a comment or ask a question?
Sure. Yeah.
The question on the land use map, I've heard sort of like some vague, and I want to be kind of specific to this question. On, let's say R20 allows currently in the land use map 2 to 3 units per acre. But then you also said in that you could combine a large acreage of property and cluster all of those units in one location to save and, maybe have open space, not too different than what a PUD is, let's call it that, and have, let's say, tiny little lots, but it's all clustered together in a larger parcel of land, and that's not the way I view it. And I just want to make sure, when I look at 2 units to 3 units per acre, I think of that acre divided up into thirds, and units specific to that, whatever that, division would be of the, the acreage of 43,000. Not that you could take that area of whatever that larger acreage is and cluster all that into one spot. I'd like kind of an answer to that.
Sure. I'm not aware of anything in the land use plan that defines it that way.
It's right in the, if you have it here.
Well,
The comprehensive plan says that. It says it right on the back side of the land use map. Probably the page behind it says, and I think everybody probably is aware of that on this board after going through the Indigo project, of what the consistency, and we talked about, and at the first meeting when this came up, you agreed with the planning board's decision on Indigo because it wasn't consistent with the planning, with the density requirement. Right, and that's part of that.
Sure.
Where it says 2 to 3 units per acre, right? So when you're talking about that, and this is not trying to be hostile, I'm just trying to understand it. So in a conditional zoning request, if it's 2 to 3 units per acre, is it specific to the acreage, or can it be manipulated to cluster those units into a larger, or a more condensed location?
In my experience with Southport already, density is considered on the balance of the project, not on an individual acre. So,
But that's what it says. It says per acre.
Yes,
Right.
2 to 3 units per acre. So
Per
if you're
acre.
looking at a 50-acre site,
So let's take 300 acres, right? Times 40,000. Do the math. You're at a density close to what you went through for about 2 years with Project Indigo. I mean, that's kind of what it falls to. So I'm just trying to understand it, mainly because with that type of request, is that if the land use plan is really what, your guiding light to everything in terms of a staff recommendation, and you kind of view it that it's not tied to the actual acreage in terms of the number of units. How is it different, than what just, a year and a half of, or whatever it was, 9 months of that? How is it different? And that's kind of what I'm not understanding that. And so I think you've answered it. I think I view it differently. But that's about it. Thank
well,
you.
I can be better prepared. I don't have the land use plan in front of me, so I can be better prepared to answer that next week.
Yeah, I'll say in it there's it's just like that. It's low density, like you understand, medium density. Then it goes on to inappropriate uses, which says commercial and industrial in that. And then it says, as part of it, what's appropriate, 2 to 3 units per acre. And in the medium density, it says 4 units per acre, right? So which is kind of consistent to the R10, 10,000 square feet. So, I'm just trying to understand where that could head in terms of like a staff review of it, or is it the intent to, use that? Maybe it's a better plan to be smart development where you have clusters in certain areas. But, I could see it also being, kind of being taken advantage of in a different way. Yeah.
I knew me bringing these extra slides would be helpful. Thank you, Alderman. So these are snipped straight out of the land use plan as I have it. Now, full disclosure. The land use plan was amended in 2020. There were a lot of updates to it. One of the updates to it was that these sections used to reference specific zoning districts. They don't anymore. So when I see an allowable density of 2 to 3 units an acre, my review of it and my belief of what the intention of the land use plan specifically is after is that the 2 to 3 units per acre figure is a review of the density of the project, not on each individual acre. Now, I'll go back into the land use plan and make sure I'm not missing something, and I'll be ready to answer that more directly next week. But, and that same function would factor into those smart growth techniques, which clustering and conservation subdivisions is pretty much the main thing that's mentioned there, which is the, holding all else constant. The 2 to 3 units an acre thing doesn't go away. It's just where those 2 to 3 units an acre are on the site or within that acre changes. Go for it.
I think one way to look at this is the allowable density is a calculation, not a lot size. So you've got a gross amount of land, and you're calculating how many lots per acre of those lands you can have. And within that land, in the cluster development, you want to put the amount of lot sizes that are best for the acreage so that you can put your density in the most appropriate places. So you're looking at conservation, you're looking at your watershed, you're looking at vegetation and habitats and the best places for connectivity and those things. So again, it's a calculation, not a lot size.
Should just let you be talking the whole time.
So, can I just say one more thing to that
Sure.
point?
Yeah.
Is if you took 300 acres, that would allow close to, under that calculation, not counting the 20% of open space or roadways, but let's just say it's standalone land and you didn't have to drive to them, you could just somehow parachute in. That's 4,000 units, right? 4,000 units of housing. And we've been talking about 1,900 units through the Project Indigo process. So if that, that's kind of what I'm trying to get to, and I think you understand it. I think you're, you and Mo are looking at it the same way, but that's kind of my concern about that, so.
I just, from the perspective of if the allowable density is 2 to 3 units per acre and we've got a 300 acre parcel, the maximum density on that 300 acres would be 900 units. With 3 times 300.
Hold on a second.
I think to Rich's point too, there was a lot of confusion in Project Indigo when it came to density per acre. Because when I first interpreted it, I interpreted it just like Rich did, in that
it's 13.
There's a big difference between cluster and non-cluster. There's a big difference between cluster and where I live, which is R20 district. And so I think we should, this is a whole other conversation, but make it more distinctive as breathe some more sort of life into what 2 to 3 acres means. So it is clear.
Well, thank you. I think I said enough. Thanks.
It's a great observation, and I think there's a lot of merit to it. I appreciate it.
Anyone else? Going once? Okay, so at this point then, staff is going to take our comments here and the comments that have been made from our public and determine what further revisions might be needed, incorporated into the text revision being drafted, and come back with it at our next regular meeting, and other information that will help explain some of the things, the comments that have been made here tonight. The process that's going to be followed is the same as with any text amendment. Travis went through that earlier. Travis, can you back up to that slide where you just give the process in general, right at the beginning. Laws, I could have said it in this time frame. There we go. Sorry. So we follow this same process. We get this input. Staff is working on revising, making a text amendment that's brought back. We're having discussion about it all along. We'll have a public hearing next week and a vote by our full board. If and when we make such a referral, then our recommendation will go to the aldermen, then they have their shot at it, so to speak. They'll have discussion, they'll have public hearing. As Travis mentioned, it can come back to us again for more work. They have the final vote on whether that text amendment goes into place. So there's many layers to this, many opportunities for the public to be involved. That is the process that's already in place, has been all along. Anything else from staff on this? Anything from any members? Any announcements that we need to make?
Oh,
You do.
the not succinct guy has something to say. There is going to be, and you heard it here first, but we'll talk about this tomorrow night in the Alderman meeting too. There's going to be a joint session of the Planning Board and the Aldermen with our new city attorney, Brady Herman. He's going to be providing a general land use training to the two boards in a joint session. It is open to the public as well. Certainly would encourage anyone interested. It'll probably be more interesting than this was, so despite my best efforts. But yeah, very much looking forward to that. It's a Thursday, like we always do, March 30th, and it'll be right here in this room at 6 p.m. And the board already received a calendar invite for it earlier today. March 30th is the definite date.
Okay, folks, any other announcements? With our agenda concluded, can I get a motion to adjourn then? So moved. Second? We've got a motion on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We are adjourned at 7:29.